All right, let's begin. Chapter 1, Week 1. The first thing we're going to talk about in our book is what is biology. So turn with me to page 1 in your book and follow along as we go through. Biology is the study of life. So we're going to begin this year by looking at the physical components and processes that are necessary for life in chapters 1 through 6, and then we will explore the diversity of life in our world in chapters 7 through 14. And we will end the year by looking at how organisms live and interact with each other. So go ahead and turn to page 3. Although we say we're going to study life, the definition of life isn't always cut and dry. It actually varies among scientists. Our textbook gives us a list that shares some of the same descriptions as all scientists, but goes into more detail. So look at the top of page 3, and you will see the 7 characteristics of life recognized by most biologists. I want you to underline this, star it, do what you need to do, because this is very important. You will be responsible for this. So let's go through each one of these. Number 1 is organization. Life shows organization. When we're examining life, we need to look at 3 different levels of organization: order, complexity, and design. Order describes the sequencing or positioning of items, and it refers to the fact that the way the parts of something are arranged matters. In chemistry, we know that elements joined in different ways can make completely different substances. Another example of order would be the repeating patterns in salt crystals. Complexity describes the amount of interacting components involved in a system. An example of this would be studying a large molecule that's composed of several smaller molecules. And design shows that the arrangement has purpose. So when we look for life, we look for all 3. An example of this would be DNA. It has order, complexity, and shows purpose. The next characteristic that we're going to go over is metabolism. A living organism must have the ability to obtain energy and use it for building molecules that are essential for life and carrying out the various life processes. And the sum of all these reactions in individual cells is metabolism. And you'll find that definition at the bottom of page 3. Now, there are 2 categories of metabolism: catabolism and anabolism. These are both defined for you in your book, again on page 3. Catabolism breaks down molecules and releases energy. Anabolism builds molecules and requires energy. Now I want you to circle or underline or highlight somehow in your book or on your notes the cat at the beginning of catabolism and the ana at the beginning of anabolism. In a way to help you remember what they each do is the phrase Anna builds, but her cat destroys. Anabolism builds, but catabolism destroys or breaks apart. Okay? So anabolism builds molecules, and it requires energy to do that. Catabolism breaks down molecules and releases the energy. It's important to note that almost all the energy in our system ultimately comes from the sun, and it comes from the sun through photosynthesis. Now, if we look at page 4 in your book, we see an example of a food web. Now, plants are considered primary producers. They produce, they perform anabolism to make energy storing molecules that other organisms then eat and break down, or catabolism. The next characteristic is homeostasis. Homeostasis is when living organisms have the ability to control their internal environment to try to keep it constant. And this ability ranges from the simple cell to the complex body systems that all work together. One example is our body's ability to maintain its internal temperature. Now, I want to note that this is a short-term adjustment to a changing environment. And when we talk about these adjustments to changing environments, this brings us to the next characteristic, which is the ability to respond to stimuli. Okay? Response to stimulus. This is number 4. It's found at the top of page 5. Living organisms have the ability to respond to stimuli, and this is generally a short-term response. For example, plants growing in response to the stimulus of sunlight. Our bodies also respond to sunlight. We make vitamin D. Another characteristic, the 5th characteristic, is adaptation. Now, I want you to understand that adaptation is a long-term adjustment to change in an environment. And adaptation can happen over several generations. Sometimes changes in environment can favor certain physical traits of a species, and this means that those with those traits survive and reproduce, and they pass on these favorable traits, such as coloration, that helps with camouflage, or beak shape, that helps with eating the food that's available in a specific environment, or fur length. Another adaptation that the book points out is the ability of organisms to form symbiotic relationships with another organism of a different species. So all forms of life must also be capable of reproducing and passing genetic information along. This also includes the ability for individual cells to reproduce and pass on its genetic information. So this 6th characteristic of life, which is reproduction and heredity, also includes reproduction and heredity at the cellular level. So this can happen through asexual means, where one organism produces an offspring that is genetically identical to itself, or it can happen through the combination of genetic material from the 2 biological sexes of a species. In both types of reproduction, the genetic information is transmitted through the molecule known as deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. And then the 7th and final characteristic of life is the ability to grow and develop. Okay, we're on page 8 now in your book. This growth can be from increasing the size of cells, increasing the number of cells, or both. So development refers to the process of becoming mature, and this can mean a change in appearance or even form. An organism can begin as a single cell that splits many times. As it splits, the resulting cells can change and develop into different types of cells that specialize in special tasks or specific tasks, like organizing to become a muscle cell or skin cell, and this is called differentiation. So those are the 7 characteristics of life. So let's look at section 1.2. If we look at figure 1.7 on page 9, this figure shows a representation of the general organization of all life. The 98 naturally occurring atoms combine to form all the parts of the physical world, and about 25 of them combine in characteristic ways to form thousands of different molecules that have specific properties important to living organisms. And these molecules then join together to form macromolecules that then combine into basic structure called organelles that make up the cell. And in multi-cell organisms, tissue is formed when these cells join and work together for a specific purpose. And then when tissues join and work together, organs are formed. And a group of organs that work together are called an organ system. And the organ systems work together to form an organism. And organisms that are capable of interbreeding only among themselves to form non-sterile offspring are part of the same species. A group of species interacting in a particular environment is called a population, and interactions of different populations in a specific area is a community. And these communities interact with each other in the physical world around them in an ecosystem, and then ecosystems interact to form biomes, and all the biomes together becomes the biosphere of Earth. Now, let's move on to section 1.3. This is where we get into the biological classification or taxonomy. While scientists have been studying life, they've noted that the differences and similarities in how organisms perform the processes of life, like metabolism, reproduction, growth, and development. They also needed a system to name and classify organisms. A scientist named Carl Linnaeus developed a system that both classified animals and standardized their official names for biologists. This is called taxonomy. Both living and extinct organisms are classified and named using this system. So look at page 12. Our slide is basically the same thing, but it illustrates the specification of the categories a little bit better when it's shaped like a pyramid. You can see how it becomes very specific down at the end. There's many members at the top, and then there are fewer members at the bottom. So each of these divisions separate organisms into smaller groups to facilitate studying them. The similarity between members of each groups also increases as you move down. But this means the number of groups in each level increases as well as you're organizing them. It's important to note as you move down, it becomes more difficult to classify some organisms as they may not always fall neatly into a specific category. Not all scientists are going to agree for every classification, and some organisms are reclassified over time. Also, some groups end up having subgroups as well. No classification is going to be perfect. There is always going to be exceptions to every rule. So if we start at the top, we have life, and then life is divided into domains. We have 3 different domains as of now that we divide life into. The 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The members of the first 2, bacteria and archaea, consist of single prokaryotic cells, while the members of eukarya are made of single or many eukaryotic cells. So what does that mean? So prokaryotic cells do not have organelles like a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells have organelles and are more complex. I want you to take a minute and turn to page 62 in your textbook. And on that page, you're going to see an illustration of a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell. And you can compare the two. You can see the organelles in the eukaryotic cells. As it notes in the caption, prokaryotic cells are generally a lot smaller than eukaryotic cells. So moving on, bacteria are found in almost any environment. Archaea are similar to bacteria, but they're usually found in very extreme and inhospitable environments, like hot geysers like they have in Yellowstone, or even in very, very cold frozen glaciers. Within the domain Eukarya, there are 4 kingdoms: Protista, fungi or fungi. Protista are the single-celled and some simple multicelled organisms. Fungi or fungi, which is how the book wants you to pronounce it, are mushrooms and yeasts. And then we have the plants and we have the animals of all sizes. So after being classified into kingdoms, living organisms are usually further classified by their characteristics into smaller and smaller groups until they have a unique and specific classification for their population. Look at page 13 at table 1.1 at the bottom of the page. This compares the complete taxonomy of 3 organisms. I want you to notice how far down we have human and domestic dog and the tulip. They're all in the same domain, but once we get past domain, the human and the dog are separated into the kingdom Animalia. And then they are further together when they go down to the phylum, which is Chordata, because they both have backbones. And they are both mammals, so they continue to be in the same group, the class, because they have hair, they're warm-blooded, etc., which gives them much more in common with each other. So they're in class Mammalia, and it isn't until the order that they actually split off. Humans are in the primate order, and dogs are in the carnivora order. So we use the 2 bottom categories for the scientific name of specific organisms, the genus and the species. The genus name is capitalized, the species is not, like Homo sapiens. It is also italicized. We call this binomial nomenclature, which means the 2 naming procedure here. As mentioned earlier, there can also be subspecies. So like a domesticated dog is actually a Canis lupus familiaris. Okay. An Arabian wolf is Canis lupus arabs. Okay, so sometimes it can be divided even further. In taxonomy, generally, the further down 2 species line up in the taxonomy, the more they have in common. As you look at the plants on the chart, the tulip, you see that their taxonomy is even more subdivided. There are subkingdoms, superdivisions, and divisions instead of phylum in there. So usually in class, we spend the second hour doing a lab or an activity. And this is because biology class focuses on experimental sciences, which deals with experimental science deals with observing and testing to gain an understanding of the physical world. However, this isn't the only realm of science that you will encounter. Inferential science involves studying the physical world as it is now and then making inferences about how it came to be like that. Geology, paleontology, forensic science, those fall into this category. Another realm of science that the book discusses is philosophy of science, which focuses on the values and beliefs about the world that scientists have that influence their interpretation of their observations and data. And then the 4th realm of science is the history of science. This studies what was taught in the past and how advancement has occurred. It also reveals the pitfalls and limitations of science. When you look at the history, you see that many scientific conclusions that were held in the past were wrong, even when their observations and data seem to prove them right. This realm of the history of science reminds us that science can only provide an understanding based on evidence that is currently available. Any attempt to go beyond that is conjecture and speculation. Okay. For your homework, you're going to be required to do the comprehension check questions in the chapter review. I want to go over what is required of you for your homework. The instructions for your homework answers are to restate the information from the question, give an answer and explain it when possible, write in complete sentences, answer all parts of the question. Many questions have more than one part, more than one question. Make sure you have answered it fully. You must include the word with all definitions from the chapter review. The answers and definitions must be from the book, not Google, not AI. Okay? So I want to go over with you just some of the comprehension check questions and give you examples of how I would like for you to answer them or what acceptable answers are. Take a minute to read the first comprehension check question on page 9 at the top. It says, you will learn later that DNA not only governs reproduction, but it also tells cells what chemicals they need to build and how to build them. In this role, does DNA direct anabolism or catabolism? An acceptable answer would be, remember, restate the information in the question, answer, and explain it, and write in complete sentences. So an example would be, when DNA tells cells what and how to build, it directs anabolism because anabolism reactions build complex molecules. Okay. Now look at number 2. Number 2 has 2 different question marks there. That gives you an idea that you're going to need to answer both parts. Okay. So here is an example of a possible answer to this question. And an example of a possible answer to 1.3. Okay. You will be responsible for completing 1 through 6 comprehension check questions for your homework. So make sure to check ThinkWave for all of your assignments and the messages with your assignment descriptions.